By the summer of 1916, the First World War had devolved into a brutal stalemate, with trenches stretching from the Swiss border to the North Sea. The Western Front was a static hellscape of mud, barbed wire, and relentless death, where any attempt to break through resulted in catastrophic losses. Defensive technology, especially machine guns and artillery, far outpaced offensive tactics, trapping millions in a cycle of futility. The high commands of both sides desperately sought a way to break the deadlock and end the war. The Somme offensive was born from this desperation, a planned joint Anglo-French assault to shatter the German lines. But when the Germans attacked Verdun in early 1916, the French were forced to divert their strength, leaving the British to take the lead at the Somme. The battle's objectives shifted, not just to break through, but to relieve the pressure on the French at Verdun and keep the Allied cause alive. The British had to attack, drawing German forces away from Verdun to prevent a French collapse. The Somme became a test of endurance and a desperate effort to save an ally, not just to win ground. It was a gamble, one that would come at a terrible cost. The fate of the Allied war effort now rested on the fields of the Somme. Allied commanders, led by Britain's Sir Douglas Haig, envisioned the Somme as a decisive breakthrough. The plan overwhelmed the Germans, punch a hole in their lines, and restore movement to the battlefield. If a breakthrough failed, the fallback was attrition, wearing down the German army through sheer weight of numbers. The Somme was also a rescue mission designed to force the Germans to divert resources from Verdun and save the French army from collapse. For Britain, it was the first major test of its new volunteer armies, Kitchener's army, made up of civilians eager to prove themselves. The battle would demonstrate Britain's commitment and military might to both allies and enemies. Success at the Somme would show the British Empire could fight on the same scale as France and Germany. The stakes were enormous. Victory could change the course of the war. Failure would be catastrophic. The Somme was set to become the crucible of the Allied war effort. Preparations for the Somme were unprecedented in scale. The British planned a week-long artillery bombardment, over 1.5 million shells, to obliterate German defenses. The hope: destroy trenches, cut barbed wire, and leave the enemy shattered for an easy infantry advance. Behind the lines, a logistical miracle unfolded. New railways, roads, and mountains of supplies built up for the assault. The British force was a mix of battle-hardened veterans and enthusiastic but inexperienced volunteers, many in PAL's battalions. These men trusted their commanders and believed the artillery would clear the way. But the Germans had spent 2 years fortifying their lines with deep bunkers that could withstand even the heaviest shelling. When the bombardment began, German troops simply waited it out underground. The British were preparing for a battle they hoped would be swift and decisive. The Germans, however, were ready for a siege. Both sides braced for a confrontation that would test every limit. The stage was set for a clash unlike any before. At 7:30 a.m. on July 1st, 1916, the whistles blew and tens of thousands of British soldiers advanced across no man's land. They expected little resistance, but the German defenders, sheltered in deep dugouts, emerged and unleashed a storm of machine gun fire. The British bombardment had failed. Many shells were duds, barbed wire remained, and German positions were largely intact. Advancing in slow, heavy waves, the British were cut down in staggering numbers. Entire battalions were wiped out within minutes. By day's end, the British suffered over 57,000 casualties, 19,000 killed, the bloodiest day in their military history. The generals' plans had collided with the brutal reality of modern warfare. The belief that artillery alone could win the battle proved tragically wrong. While the French achieved some success in the south and a few British units captured their objectives, these gains were isolated. The promise of a breakthrough was shattered. The Somme had begun not with victory, but with catastrophe. The scale of loss stunned the world. The battle's true horror was only just beginning. After the first day's disaster, the Somme became a grinding battle of attrition. Grand offensives gave way to small, brutal fights for trenches, woods, and villages. Names like Highwood and Pozières became synonymous with slaughter. The British adapted, abandoning rigid formations for more flexible tactics and introducing new weapons like the Stokes mortar and Mills bomb. The creeping barrage, artillery fire moving just ahead of the infantry, offered some protection. September saw the debut of the tank, slow and unreliable, but a glimpse of warfare's future. Troops from across the British Empire, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, South Africa, fought and died in the mud. The Australians suffered terribly at Pozières. The Canadians later achieved hard-won successes. The battle dragged on, with every yard of ground paid for in blood. The Somme became a test of endurance, innovation, and sacrifice. The cost was staggering, but the fighting showed no sign of ending. The German army's defense on the Somme was fierce and disciplined. Deep dugouts allowed them to survive bombardments and emerge to mow down attackers with machine guns. Early German tactics demanded immediate counterattacks, but this proved unsustainable and led to horrific losses. New leadership shifted to a more flexible defense, holding the front lightly and counterattacking only when necessary. German soldiers endured the same mud, shelling, and terror as the Allies, calling the Somme das Blutbad. Shell shock and exhaustion took a heavy toll on both sides. Despite immense suffering, the Germans held their lines, inflicting devastating casualties. But the battle was bleeding them dry, killing off their best soldiers and forcing reliance on inexperienced conscripts. The Somme left the German army permanently scarred, even in defense. The cost of holding the line was almost as great as attacking it. As autumn arrived, relentless rain turned the Somme into a sea of mud. Movement became nearly impossible. Trenches collapsed and wounded men drowned in shell holes. The mud was as deadly as enemy fire. Despite the appalling conditions, Allied commanders pressed on, convinced the Germans were near collapse. Attacks continued into November, now for the smallest gains, sometimes just a single trench. Soldiers faced exhaustion, cold, and disease. Morale plummeted as survival became the only goal. The battle finally ground to a halt in mid-November, halted by winter's onset. The big push ended not in triumph, but in mutual exhaustion. The front line had barely moved, and both armies were shattered. The Somme faded into the mud and snow, leaving only devastation behind. The numbers from the Somme are staggering. Over 1 million casualties in 141 days. The British Empire suffered around 420,000 casualties. The French, 200,000. The Germans, up to 500,000. Communities across Britain and its empire lost a generation of young men. The French, already bleeding at Verdun, were pushed to the brink. The German army lost many of its best soldiers, a blow from which it never fully recovered. All this for a maximum advance of just 6 miles. The front line barely shifted. The cost in lives was almost unimaginable. The Somme became a symbol of futile sacrifice and industrialized slaughter. The landscape was scarred, but the scars on nations and families ran deeper. The true legacy of the Somme was its human cost. The Somme was seen as a disaster, but its impact was complex. It achieved its key aim, relieving pressure on the French at Verdun and saving the Allied front. The German army was irreparably weakened, forced to rely on inexperienced conscripts and eventually retreat to the Hindenburg Line. For Britain, the Somme was a harsh but necessary education, transforming its army into a modern, professional force. Tactical and technological lessons learned in 1916 paved the way for victory in 1918. Today, the Somme stands as a symbol of sacrifice and the horrors of industrialized war. Its cemeteries and memorials, like Thiepval, remind us of the cost of conflict. The legacy is not one of victory or defeat, but of endurance, sacrifice, and remembrance. The Somme warns us of the true price of war.